Avoiding the traditional argument that rightly or wrongly, Corbusier's Chandigarh is an imposition of monological Western ideas onto an Eastern context, Vikram explored how the city was the product of a negotiation between Corbusier, who saw India as the primal home of architecture, and Nehru, India's prime minister, who saw the modern West as the future of India. Vikram, again, is now revising this along with his dissertation, Identity Production in Post-Colonial Indian Architecture, Hegemony and Its Discontents in 19th Century Jaipur, for publication as a book, The Outsider Inside, The Making of a Modern Indian Architecture. In this book, he investigates how it is that modernity has come to be woven into the fabric of India as an indispensable, yet somehow outside part of that nation's post-colonial identity. In The Outsider Inside, then, Prakash's goal is to articulate the manner in which the West has become a part of the national identity of India as an outsider that is within. In other words, modernity becomes a mirrored equivalent of the Orient, the other within. The West is a necessary outsider, then, within post-colonial identity. The colonial and post-colonial transformations of Jaipur and Chandigarh thus come to serve as case studies for this project. If the case study of Chandigarh explores the role of a modern India, his case study of Jaipur explores the transformation of architectural culture and the built environment in the latter half of the 19th century. Here, too, Prakash departs from the familiar terrain of Orientalist analysis and colonization, in which the historian discovers the colonizer projecting a previously constituted and misguided imperial vision onto the passive body of the colonized. That form of analysis ultimately only replicates the hierarchical structure colonizer-colonized, in which the colonizer is active and the colonized is passive. Instead, Prakash's case study of Jaipur investigates the role of the presences, resistances, and subjectivities of the colonized subject in the development of both architecture as discipline in India and architecture as built object in that context. In today's talk, Vikram will extend his analysis of these cross-cultural themes in architecture into the present day. As a theoretical foundation to a studio to be taught in fall 1999 in Ahmedabad in collaboration with the Technical University at Delft, the approaches outlined here will, I'm sure, be a provocative and incisive addition to our discourse here at SCI-Arc and in Los Angeles. So now I introduce to you Vikram Prakash.
Well, thank you, Kazis, for extremely generous introduction. So you can blank out most of that except the last two sentences, because this book that I'm writing, I spent so much time writing it, I don't really want to talk about that today. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is related more to the direction that I'm going to be going next after this book is done, and this India studio that we are going to be doing in fall 99. So I'll talk about that as we move along. Right, that's a slide of University of Washington on the left and the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Ahmedabad, where we'll be doing the studio. So this paper today is entitled Subaltern Master Planning, ? Towards a New Ethic of International Practice. Its subtitle is Notes Towards the Pedagogy of the India Studio, and that's what this paper, in a sense, is all about. When I was first invited to present here at SCI-Arc, I thought I would present a paper delineating the pedagogical strategy of this quarter-long studio in India that is scheduled for fall 99, sponsored by the University of Washington and the Vastushil Foundation in Ahmedabad, India. That studio is designed to engage an urban-scale problem, working in active collaboration with academics, professionals, and community leaders from Ahmedabad, India. Ahmedabad is a city in Western India with one of the better schools of architecture. If one conceives academic pedagogy as practice professionalism, if one does that, my pedagogical position would be that the only way to ethically conduct professional practice is through effective community participation. Common enough position. Although valid everywhere and at all times, practiced as such processes, I contend, are more useful and effective in the so-called third world, where people do not necessarily expect the state to deliver in any case. My intention, if I spoke only about the Ahmedabad studio, was to submit the ideas of the studio to you as an academic audience and get some critical feedback. In a sense, that's sort of the context of what we would do in the studio. That's University of Washington on the left, and this would be the kind of displacement that would occur when you take students across to an entirely different cultural and economic context, is sort of the idea behind what might happen. And the basic principle about what we would do over there would be to learn, let us just say, designing through community participation, which these somewhat staged slides are attempting to represent. In the course of my email discussions with Kaziz and Poonam, I came to the conclusion that it might be better if I presented a more general critique of globalization. A critique that could both recognize the power and impetus of the forces at work in this new process and at the same time somehow be critical of it. So I decided to represent my pedagogical interest in the form of a question that a friend and colleague of mine from chair of the planning department at Michigan one asked. That is the question, what are the local global issues that one must anticipate if one is preparing to practice as professional architects and planners at the community level in the rapidly globalizing context of cities such as India? So maybe you can simply call it international practice. You know, I mean, that's one way I try and put this across in Seattle. How does one do, what should one know if one is setting out to do international practice in a context such as India? And that's the question for me. I mean, in a sense, that's the question I'm starting to get after. I think it's an important and obvious question. Everybody's talking about it, and this paper today and some of the thoughts that I'm going to put forward to you are preliminary thinking in that direction, informed from whatever little I might say I have understood by what is known as post-colonial studies. So having never been trained as a planner or a community activist, I would of course have much to learn about such local global issues, such as community initiative, sustainable design, cultural preservation, and so on. These are the kind of terms you hear in planning circles. Nevertheless, I do believe that our academic training in education in architecture, even if it may not adequately prepare us for what is called the profession, I do believe that it does prepare us to think in a holistic manner, that is to think in a manner that can access, address, and cohere a broad range of subjects and issues without being bogged down with the necessities of being a specialist. We are taught, in other words, to think in an interdisciplinary manner. And unlike the sort of recent interest in interdisciplinary thinking, such as in culture studies, we are also persuaded to use interdisciplinary thinking to imagine possibilities and lived solutions for our world. So that's how I would like to think how we put together studios. And I think as a way of thinking, that's the most important part, in a sense, of our training, which enables us to address a number of fields together and makes it a way of thinking which is very much in resonance with, let us say, the thinking of culture studies. So that's the spirit in which I feel I can address issues which would strictly be planning, and I think we as architects should be addressing these in this spirit. So with that kind of approach, as if I was preparing for a studio problem, I would like to broach this question of preparing to practice as professional architects through another reading of pedagogy. In today's presentation, by pedagogy, I will mean not just academic pedagogy as practice professionalism or interdisciplinary studio thinking, but pedagogy in the general sense, in the sense, for instance, that Paulo Freire talks about it in his widely influential text on development activism, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That is, pedagogy as the legitimate process of learning while acting responsibly and ethically as professionals in life. Unlike traditional conceptions of professional work that require acting on the basis of acquired learning, which I suppose is the primary function and some would say the only legitimate function of academia, I'm going to suggest that professional practice requires a certain kind of learning as a necessary component of its practice. So that's in a sense is basically the argument that I'm going to try and make, contrary to a model which would say, okay, you learn the theory or the method at school or in early studies, you go out and practice it. One needs to, of course, think of practice in such a way which also involves a certain kind of learning as a part of its practice, so that we don't necessarily think of these two things in such clearly oppositional terms. In other words, I'm going to almost circumvent my proposed question, and rather than expand on a list of relevant issues, I'm going to expand pedagogy into an inquiry of professionalism. I will do this by deliberating on the politics of representation in professional practice, and I will suggest that learning to identify and to work with the correct collection of issues and agents, that's learning to learn correctly, is at least as, if not more important, than fielding an anticipatory list of local global issues that one must address in a field of action. So I'm speaking, therefore, I'm taking the position of an academic. I'm not going to list for you, I'm not going to take the position and list, well, these are the things you need to keep in mind when you go out to do international practice. I'm going to address it in a pedagogic and as an academic and see how that kind of learning can be brought to praxis. So from this, it would therefore be obvious that I speak today as an academic, and my imagined audience is, let us say, primarily practicing architects and students imagined, let us say, in the future of South Asia cities. But I'm, of course, going to generally be concerned with the general issue of globalization, which strings all of us in the loop. So I'll talk mostly about South Asia, and I'll read my observations and then show some slides by way of observation, by illustration, to talk about issues that are all going to be located in South Asia, but which hopefully have, of course, a broader resonance. So, let me begin then with a story. Last year, I attended two related conferences in Jakarta, Indonesia, entitled The Future of Asia's Cities and Tradition and Modernity, Contemporary Architecture in Southeast Asia and Beyond. The first conference, organized by the Asia Society, was inaugurated by President Suharto, who was in power still then, and consisted of a series of high-power panel discussions amongst senior government officials, influential developers, World Bank representatives, powerful bankers, along with architects, planners, academics, and development activists. And these are two slides from that conference over there, and you can see the kind of sponsorship and kind of discussion that was going on over there, and they're discussing the future of Asia's cities. As you know, the scale and amount of building that is taking place in Southeast Asia today is mind-numbing. Far from being an exceptional extravaganza, the Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur, for instance, are only the latest outgrowths of a huge colony of skyscrapers that are now crowding all the major cities in the region. So here are some illustrations for you to see stuff like they have seen already. So that's Kuala Lumpur, the Petronas Towers, and that's other construction that you can see. You know, that scene on the left is a scene you see everywhere all the time in Jakarta when you're over there. And this is what was completely mind-boggling for me when I went over there. Coming from India, you think, well, okay, it'll be a little advanced, a little more developed than India, but when you go over there, you just cannot believe the rate and amount of transformation that's taking place. And I know we've all heard about this, but till you see it, it's kind of totally unbelievable. The skyline is dotted with these cranes that are putting one building up after the other. A whole series of questions can, of course, be asked regarding what exactly are the sort of financial arrangements that are made to put up these buildings, especially given the recent crash. And that would be a question for an economist or somebody to respond to in what I'm going to say. This is Singapore. The more organized of these cities, if I can figure out. Thank you. This happens to everyone. Okay, I'll try and do the left, and if you can catch the right one with it, that would be great. Hong Kong, a slightly different case scenario, but similar. I mean, Hong Kong is, of course, a slightly different history and financial history, which makes it a different case, but nevertheless, it is a place where you see a lot of development of this kind. So I'll leave you with these two images, which are not in LA or anywhere on the West Coast, but the one on the left is in Hong Kong, and the one on the right is Kuala Lumpur with that housing development that's going on in the back over there, which could be very similar to what you're seeing. So this is what's going on. By all projections, this building boom is expected to continue unabated, and consequently, the urban population of the region is expected to double in the coming 10 years. This is, I'm sure, it's going to happen regardless of this bust that supposedly has recently taken place. Dependent on their point of view, the panelists at this amazing conference, the Future of Asia Cities Conference, saw the staggering changes anticipated in the future of Asia's cities as looming horizons of crisis or more often of opportunity. And that's what the debate was all about. You know, is this really great or is this really bad? And mostly, you know, how are we going to make this happen? Now, the second conference on tradition and modernity was confined mostly to academics such as myself, from the University of Tasmania and Indonesia, earnestly debating the relevance of traditional and modern architecture for the emerging architectural profession of the region. Since most of the colossal work being done in the area is done by American and Australian firms, this conference sought to do the good work of legitimizing and empowering local professionals by setting the terms of a meaningful debate. As its title suggested, this conference aspired to a negotiated peace between conceptions of tradition and the forces of modernity, aspiring perhaps for a balance of the kind that might be articulated by Kenneth Frampton and others under the general rubric of critical regionalism, I suppose. Not explicitly used terms, but that's sort of the ballpark. Although my viewpoint was somewhat different, this is the conference where I read my paper. In contrast with the numbers and forces that were discussed at the first conference, the timidity and lack of conviction of the concerns of the second were mind-numbing and debilitating. It was so obvious that a handful, or even a reasonably large number of well-intentioned architects, urban designers, and planners working with the general agenda of preserving local identity by historic preservation strategies, or by building buildings that use local materials and work with traditional urban forms, may produce occasional examples of good design, but they are certainly not going to in any way challenge the dictates of a globalizing market. That just was so obvious. And I'm going to, by way of illustration, show you examples of, what I would consider to be good examples of good architecture done by good architects in South Asia that I know of. And these were the examples shown and again, but they are not a force that is there. And here are Charles Correa's housing schemes. These are the kind of things. Here is also again Charles's Museum for Arts and Crafts. It's sort of symptomatic of mostly of the kind of role that tradition and culture ends up playing in situations such as this, that you end up museumizing it in various ways. And here is a building that he designed, also an excellent building. It's really very nice spatially and aesthetically, and I could go on and on. I've written a whole paper about it. But again, the point is that culture and identity becomes this sort of enclosed space which must be localized to a building such as this, which is a cultural center, so that these small institutional buildings have to carry the force and weight of everything that tradition and identity is supposed to be able to do, while behind the scenes, or not even behind the scenes, right next door, the charge is the entire urban scene is changed overnight. So when you put the forces of the World Bank in cahoots with those of the priorities of the national governments of countries, it is very difficult to challenge such impetuses through good architecture. On the other hand, I also, of course, felt that I could not unproblematically simply jump on the Southeast Asia bandwagon and say, let's just redo the cities, because the environmental and human costs of a project directed towards capitalist maximization of profit are, of course, just too high to ignore. I came back feeling, therefore, that to understand the full impact of the kind of development that is going on today, one needed something of a paradigm shift of a kind that is still unclear to me. And I was left with the question that if the future of Asia's cities is being decided in the boardrooms of power, where ethical responsibility is gauged by returns on investment, how are we as academics and professionals to forge an adequate response and alternative? In that context, being from where I am, I suppose, I was born and brought up in Chandigarh. I'm sorry, okay, here are 2 more slides of Doshi's works in terms of the previous context. In that context of trying to grapple with what else can we do in the changing scenario of Southeast Asia, I could not but help think that what we might need to resort to was the discredited modernist idea of alternative master planning. I felt that perhaps we needed once again that large-scale thinking that can anticipate new cities, that can furnish not only the kind of list of things that I had spoken about earlier, but also coherent visions for the new megacities, master plans that can rival the plans of the developers in the off chance that we might yet have our dreams. So maybe that's what we need to do to get out there in Southeast Asia, where change is taking place every day. And by master planning, I do not mean creating city master plans as planners do. I'm talking about modernist master planning. Here are just illustrative examples that I put in, of course, Cobb's work these are the kind of images that, in a sense, jump right into your mind, whether we should be as things that might be evocative in some way. Keith, can you do the right slide, please? Thanks. And of course, in particular, I was thinking of the city whose slide is hopefully going to show up on the right-hand side, which is Chandigarh, which is the quintessential example of an effort at making a master planned city in the context of South Asia, made by Cobb in the 1950s, which is widely battered in most circles as precisely the kind of thing that we must not do. But when you go and see what is actually happening in very recent years, because of the kind of transformation that you're witnessing, you almost wish that there was a master plan such as this in place, which might give direction to what one could do. And here is another example, again, Charles Correa, who took kind of a broad scale planning approach for the designs of Bombay, thinking of putting together linear cities based on nodes and transportation systems, designing for 2 million people. So here are Charles's plans for New Bombay. Again, I'm not going to describe these plans because I'm not saying this is the way to do it. I'm showing these as way of illustrations. So maybe this is what we should be doing, but yet as the long history of modernism in both the West and the Third World has taught us, this enterprise of master planning runs the serious risk of being ineffectual or worse, counterproductive. Modernist plans have always ended up serving hegemonic interests, after all. There are many occasional successes, and there certainly may be ways of contextually relocating the complexities of modernist planning interests in the Third World. But by and large, the postmodern and postcolonial critiques in specific and historical evidence in general have unquestionably established that around the world, modernism was unable to even unstage its colonial inheritance, far less realize its decolonized utopian visions, if utopian visions was modernists' aspiration. And I've written about this extensively somewhere else. So, if globalization today demands a master planning response to stand the possibility of being effective, but master planning is precisely what has thwarted resistance, we find ourselves in the clutches of an ethical dilemma where there is a right, so to say, on both sides of the ideological battlefield, which would raise, at least for those raised on Hindu thought, the difficult old question of ascertaining right action in a field of seemingly equivalent choices. Charles Correa, writing in The New Landscape, articulated this dilemma as follows, quote, "When we plan cities of 2 million and more, we are necessarily faced with the question, what right does one person have to master plan for so many? And yet, as professionals, we also have to ask, what right do we have to just stand and watch the degradation of our cities?" Unquote. To understand our choices, and since I know a little of Indian history, let me elaborate the first half of the dilemma by rehearsing the critique of India's state-sponsored project of modernization. The critical issue, of course, turns on the question of the ethics of representation both in the political sense of speaking for and the aesthetic sense of representing or saying anew. In India, the Nehruvian project of modernization did not work because the people, the representative citizens, were not involved in the process, I'd suggest, as a massive simplification of a huge process. Laurie Baker, the English architect who has practiced on a small scale in southern India for the last 40-odd years, voiced this simply by starting a speech on the topic architecture and the people with the following, quote, "The subject given to me is architecture and the people. Did the promoters mean the people, or could they have said architecture and people? Saying the people implies that we architects are in one category and the people are in another." So, to illustrate the talk, I mean, that's Nehru on the left, the architect of India's modernization, and just reminding you of the general story of modernization that took place in India in the 1940s, in the 50s, after independence from British rule. And here is Chandigarh, the city that Cobb put together completely, as they say, by himself. There were certainly no participations with anybody else. So in India, the architects and planners are considered professionals, and in terms of our colonial and modern legacy, they are in one category and the people in another. Not that that's untrue for the US. That is what it means to be professional, that is to be not untrained. Consequently, modernism, not only architectural but also economic and institutional, certainly produced a great deal of professional expertise, and we see slides like this on the right, Cobb, instructing Doshi and other people. So it produced a great deal of professional expertise, but it failed to stage decolonization because its elitist top-down framing never enabled it to gain the legitimacy to properly represent, to speak for the people in whose name it was exercised. The failure here was not of translation, but of the transfer of idiom, caught in the replay of the colonial web of professionalism. So, since you have to be a professional. In addition, the modernist epistemological claims failed to gain legitimacy because they did not translate. Modernism, to drastically condense political post-colonial critiques, was ultimately Eurocentric. Its aspirations, however laudable, were located in the European Enlightenment, that, however influential, was, let's say, ultimately born of Judeo-Christian lineage, ultimately in the sense that it could not be. This is the issue of aesthetic representation, the saying anew, where the saying anew amounted to a re-saying of the Eurocentric epistemology. This issue is more complicated, and one could, of course, delineate the modalities of the translation of idiom here through a discussion of the ready incorporation of the Eurocentric idiom in the post-colonial episteme of the Third World. I have written of this elsewhere, but in the present context, it will suffice to note that in the end, such translations like those colonial help reconstruct powerful post-colonial identities such as nationalism, but are unable to offer strategies for effective resistance to counter neo-colonial processes such as globalization that we are witnessing today. So, just to gloss over a simple topic. And this is how I thought I'd visually illustrate the point. If you are familiar with Cobb, that this is a Swiss franc, 10 franc bill, and it shows the elevation of the Secretariat, if you can make it out, that building over there, which we saw earlier in slides, and that's the full elevation over here. On the back side of this 10 franc bill is a portrait of Corbusier. And I was really shocked to see it because this is my building. I was born and brought up in Chandigarh, and this is our Secretariat, and we have always thought of it like that. But it gets claimed almost entirely in the European episteme, as this bill says. But I'm, of course, saying on the other side, of course, even if this is my Chandigarh, because I was born and brought up there and identified in a certain way, how does this relate to the figure of this woman who is carrying the poured-in-place concrete that was used to make the buildings in the first place? So that's the two failures of modernism. I'm doing a critique here of myself of the desire to master plan, just rehearsing familiar things. So if that is true, that the European Enlightenment and its offspring may help frame but is not likely to stage decolonization in the Third World is chronicled in stories of resistance, as for instance in Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva's influential text on women's ecological movement, Ecofeminism. In this book, Mies and Shiva's central contention is that all the significant grassroots movements that have resisted globalization over the last 40 years or so have their ideological origins not in academic writing or in global narratives such as those of modernism or Marxism, but in the coherences and contingencies of the everyday lives of the people, particularly of the women that are affected at the nether reaches of patriarchal, capitalist, neocolonial, globalizing, and other hegemonic processes. I'm offering this as a case study, not the case study, as some people might. In this book, Shiva and Mies demonstrate that, amongst a lot of books like this, that women around the world under great bodily and emotional threat have repeatedly resisted the destructive erosion and transformation of their daily eco-life world, and have done so not only because they have felt economically exploited, but perhaps more so because such hegemonic processes directly and indirectly threaten and destructively rewrite the ecologically informed coherence of their epistemological life, worlds that sustain their individual and social sense of selves. Okay, I mean, so the argument that they make is, yeah, of course there's exploitation, and the whole broad structures are very clear and apparent, but resistance in their lives organizes itself because the way they put together their life, the everyday coherences are the ones that become challenged and need to be rewritten. That's what they resist. They can't figure out how what is happening figures into the day life, so they resist. How does one illustrate a thing like this? I can't, so I just have these slides over here, and I show the woman on the slide on the left, which I can't see quite clearly, but you can see her carrying the huge amount of load on her head, which is a daily occurrence, while there is this fruit of modernization not far behind. These are the contradictions that play themselves out into the everyday lives of the people. Slide on the right is supplementary, just complementary. Ecofeminist movements, or the kind of description that Shiva and Mies do, are thus what might be called subaltern movements, in the sense that they properly represent, that is, their voice are in the voice of those that are generally considered outside the sphere of representation, the dominant representations. Their subaltern text thus suggests that the effects of globalization, as also its resistances, are best understood as the coming together of multiplicitous micro-battles in which the known and the familiar experiences of the subaltern life world are pitted against the modern commodities-based epistemologies of the capitalist world. So, one might say that resistance does not follow a master plan, but is a collection of localized voices, each of which may have its own reason for opposition, but all of which together, in a sense, form a movement like nationalism. This subsistence perspective, or the survival perspective, as Mies and Shiva call it, is the, quote, life-producing and life-preserving work that not only is necessary, not only is a necessary precondition for survival for them, but with increasing ecological destruction, they moreover claim, quote, can show a way out of the many impasses of this destructive system. So if one agrees with the kind of analysis they do, the subaltern movement or the argument, subaltern argument is not only about the locations of resistance, but is also, and more importantly, about the location and description of the development alternatives, which is the point I'm trying to lead to. I mean, how do we find alternatives? One can quickly link the lessons of ecofeminism here to those of the subaltern studies group. Like Maria and Vandana, the subaltern historiographers locate the loci and contours of historical resistant movements, not in global narratives such as nationalism, but in the small-scale efforts of innumerable subaltern experiences. So just to repeat the point that I just said. So what might be these kind of effects, these kind of resistances and adaptations? I do not have examples in slides of the kinds of things Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva talk about. But if one was to start thinking about how does this happen in architecture or in a built environment, if it does, there have to be examples everywhere all the time. And here are just simple examples, again taken from Chandigarh, where people are adapting a master plan in terms of the contingencies of their life, as for instance, using the space of the street as extended alternative accommodation. The general whole logic of how the informal economy and the informal sector occupies the city and its edges to make makeshift dwellings, not dwellings, or here I have commercial establishments, but there are examples of this everywhere. All these are in Chandigarh, and I'm particularly fond of the kind of work, that's a shopping cart on the left which supplies food to all the households in the well-planned, master-planned city of Chandigarh, where you have to go long distances to buy food if you want it fresh and cheap. So there are people who are using carts, bicycle-drawn, that come everywhere. And life happens in different ways. They make their money, although they're not allowed to live in the city. And these are the kind of markets that develop in various parts of the city. So the whole argument over here is that, these small movements, even in the place like Chandigarh, are transforming and accommodating in terms of the life worlds of these people. So in the claims of the ecofeminist and the subaltern historiographers, we have the documentation of the workings of a process of hegemonization, whose lessons for thinking effective strategies of resistance we will ignore only at our own peril. The principal lessons from the pedagogical point of view are that first, effective and lasting resistance to hegemonic processes will only be offered by those whose lives are directly and irreparably threatened, and that these are the majority and not the minority. And second, that such resistance, although it's an economic and political issue, is organized around epistemological and ideological fault lines, as it were, and not those directly economic and political, which is where architecture and urbanism as cultural systems come in. The ideal, so where does this leave us? So the ideal of necessarily working through the contingent constructions of the epistemological life worlds of the subaltern thus necessitates the effective participation of the subaltern and other marginalized groups as the prime participants and movers in any development process, not only to ensure the proper addressing of development gains, but also to facilitate the effective maintenance, reproduction, and relevant transformation of their life worlds. The latter is critical since the survival of the subaltern epistemes, as ecofeminism suggests, may be critical to the survival of all. If this is a difficult ideal, it is necessarily so, and it is perilous to ignore it. Is it possible then to return to the question that I began with, to address the subaltern perspective and its critiques of modernism? So, is it possible then to address the subaltern perspective and its critiques of modernism in the process of producing effective alternatives for the cities of the South and Southeast Asia in the throes of globalization? Is it possible, in other words, to think of subaltern master planning? At first blush, the subaltern perspective does suggest that the professional practice of architecture and planning, given its operative location in the epistemological life world of the urban elite, is inherently ideologically suspect. This is certainly a plausible claim, and its logical conclusion is that the only viable way for an urban elite to act is as facilitators of self-empowering subaltern development processes. Master planning, since it is always in some sense from above, seems to be out of the question. Now, while the jury is out, I have some provisional suggestions. So what do we do in that case? I think the limitation of the subaltern perspective is that whether it is acknowledged or not, it relies on a blind faith, let us say, on the ultimate victory of the subaltern. This faith not only potentially mystifies and fetishizes the subaltern, but more importantly runs the tremendous risk of simply being proven wrong. We have seen the destructive transformation of life worlds before, and we may see it again. The march of history is rarely the story of progress, as we know. Perhaps simply in the name of a certain caution, but more likely in that of a certain unclear realism, let me then here invoke the well-known ecological slogan as instructive of that modality of thinking and action that might be necessary for our survival. This is the modality that links two epistemological worlds, not in a hierarchical, but in a constitutive embrace. That is, think global, act local, where the local and global are, of course, allegories of each other. Perhaps the subaltern rewriting of this slogan might be the displaced inversion: local acting is global thinking. In this rewriting, global acting is opposed in the name of local acting as thinking that integrates eventually and hopefully into that global ecological idea, survival of the species. In between, within the folds then, would lie the articulation of professional work and ethical professional practice, not just master, not just facilitator. To conclude, let me sketch some of the two major terms of this, let's say, rethought professional practice. The first is obvious. If we are interested in architecture planning, and if we are interested in architecture and planning and people, if we wish to learn from and participate in the learnings of the ecofeminist world, if we wish to see our work informed by and participate in the daily eco-life world of the subalterns, we cannot afford to act from the outside as top-down professional individuals. We must learn to participate and necessarily include community participation in the field of necessities that determines any planning process. Various people have listed processes that facilitate those that develop the city community, move towards an empowerment paradigm, incorporate the corporate sector in sustainable urban development, and develop multi-stakeholder partnerships to achieve greater efficiency, improve effectiveness, and increase enrollment and equity in our cash cities. So these are sort of all kinds of participative processes that you run across in the literature. If such partnerships include subaltern representation, their importance cannot be understated. And again, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of the kinds of processes that, that one might engage in, I'm going to quickly run through slides of a program that we run out of Washington, which goes to Mexico, which is the project of building housing, clinics, women's health center in the squatter settlements of Cuernavaca, south of Mexico, whose main purpose and point is basically working with the squatter community so that the building simply becomes an agent through which students and academics and some professionals who go down can interact with the life world of the squatter communities in Mexico. And there's a lot of, basically that's the process that takes place, and they work with the masons, the master masons of Mexico, in the squatter settlement in Cuernavaca. I'm just going to quickly run through these slides just to show you what goes on over there. And this is a school under construction, which finally finishes like this, with the occupation, with the students coming in and occupying it. But partnership, and this is the second, is not only a matter of non-elitist practice, but it is also a matter of locating resistance through the epistemological categories of the subaltern. Thus, from the beginning, we must think of our professional work as not only the process of singularly legitimizing a correct way of doing things, but that of mediating the correctness of ways of doing things in various relevant epistemologies. A system of mediating various correctnesses requires an ethical framework of action that can negotiate a field of choices rather than a list of ethical prescriptions. This argues for a different conception of professional ethics, where ethics is not the work of legitimizing a particular fixed worldview, but is the more contingent, situational-based ethic that can effectively negotiate a field of choice. Such an operative ethic can be cast in the mold of a pedagogical strategy, a way of learning that discloses responsible action through the contingent but irrefutable logic of situational imperatives. Situational imperatives is a contingent logic of responsible action given as ethical frame rather than as a morality. It is an ethics of action given by proper learning in a field of choices. Put differently, it is an ethical logic by which the correct answer can only be triangulated in a field of contingent necessities, but it is important to be able to identify the field of these contingent necessities. Professional practice, as inscribed by this kind of learning, locates our work and identities as social individuals rather than as traditional autonomous professionals. As such, we can work to generate master plans, but like the incomplete and subjective consensuses of the democratic processes, we must see our plans are negotiated through subaltern life worlds as contingent and partial solutions. Contingency implies that what may be correct and adequate may not be so later at a different time and different juncture. And partiality suggests that what we produce is both incomplete and subjective versus objective. One way to open such a field of action, I will suggest, is through the establishment, especially in a world turning in the wake of globalization, of viable institutional structures with proper representation that can repeatedly assess the changing world and respond adequately by proposing alternatives in a participative manner. Perhaps we can start by rethinking the forms and roles of professional bodies, academic centers, journals, think tanks, and the like. The responsibility of the profession as well as the academic community might be to help establish and staff such institutions and pedagogical programs. Such institutions will hopefully not only provoke and sustain debates, but in the longer run, such institutions have a greater chance of sustaining themselves in a meaningful and accountable manner than the more short-term ones of grand plans or small-scale grassroots activism. So that's essentially, is the sort of provisional and small-scale starting to think about how one might think about producing an alternative practice would be, in my estimation and opinion, is not through master planning as full-scale planning, but some processes and bodies that produce plans repeatedly, but are also set up as institutions to repeatedly assess and rewrite the plans. That is pretty much the kind of process that I'm hoping to embark next fall 99 onwards, which is the India studio that Kaziz spoke about, where what we're going to do is take a group of students from University of Washington, and we're going to work with the local professional an institution in Ahmedabad, India, on the urban design of a district in the city that is about to be changed and transformed in response to new capital that's flowing in. Now, the idea of doing this project is to do it on-site, working with the institution, and presenting the project to the developers and professional bodies and the planners, and to get feedback from them. And to present it again after repeatedly processing it again. So it becomes thereby a process by which we hope to establish some kind of link between what is happening in the University of Washington and the kind of institutional bodies that are in Ahmedabad, a kind of link that is more than something that involves maybe sending students here or sending students there, but through which the two institutions can sustain each other. And that is, to my mind, the establishment of institutions, although it sounds like something that would necessarily, of course, come from an academic. To my mind, it becomes the only way that can serve as a long-term strategy of what might be called a beginning strategy towards subaltern master planning. That's all I had to say. Thank you for coming. Jesus, it's hot. Well, I can take some questions if there's somebody, if I can see somebody and somebody wants to ask a question. Oh, great. That's much better. Yeah.
You stated that your position is an academic.
Right.
One, but certainly the studios, the teaching, and the mood of the lecture is one about practice, which is, in theory, conventionally somewhat opposed to the idea of the academic, but also that the idea of dismantling plans, which is degrees of spontaneity and so forth, would want to reject academic conditions. And I just want to set up maybe a contrary thing for you to kind of work through. I was surprised that you sort of restated it casually, the position of the academic.
So you are stating the academic position as that academia always has fixed positions versus praxis which continually revises its positions. Is that?
Not so much about positions, but about audiences. And it's the audience of the student, which is articulated here, most important, whether children or college students.
I'm not sure I've completely grasped your question, but what I was trying to say was that if pedagogy is supposed to be about practice professionalism, which is what we are supposed to be doing, then what would be the way to conduct a pedagogical exercise that would be not only practice professionalism, but which would indicate a way of interacting with what would be happening professionally, that it has a two-way dialogue. So that the institution is not only a place which produces trained people, in the strict sense of trained people, but is also a place which continually looks at and revises what is going on outside. But that's only possible if that oppositional sort of sphere that exists ceases to exist. So one has to, as academic, devise policies and ways of doing things that enable a sort of in-between sphere to be established without losing a certain amount of, because we can think different, or propose alternatives, but we are not, totally divorced. But we are not just preparing trainers. So I think that's the kind of position I was trying to articulate.
Maybe it's sort of stating the question. Maybe it's follow-up. I guess my question would be about location. What's the advantage, apart from the fact that you teach at UW, University of Washington, what's the advantage of, or why bring the University of Washington students to this conference? Why not? This question to me would be why bring those students? Why bring that? Apart from the fact
Why take American students to India and do this kind of thing? If to put the
basically, in a certain sense, it would almost make sense to say you shouldn't bring American
right.
students. And I'm wondering why they're doing
That will be the first question, and that was the first question I was asked when I proposed this project in Ahmedabad. But you do that because of international practice, because this is a process that's going to happen, is happening, that 33%, even today, of all the major firms who are working in the United States, 33% of the major projects of the big firms are in Southeast Asia. And more the paradigm of development that's taking place even in a place like South Asia, where there isn't so much development, is through active collaboration with American and Australian and so on firms. So a lot of the students over here are going to be working on projects which will not be located where they are. So the standard answer, if you speak to Peter Pran or anybody in NBVJ or the big firms, is, well, why do you do these projects in Indonesia or India, which are just, you know what they are. And they say, well, that's what the people want. That's the clientele, that's what the clients want. So I'm looking at this as training the future body of people who are going to be practicing in international practice. So they are the natural people to take, at least some of them. It makes only sense in the current context. So that's why we are not going to India to study the traditional cities, which would be an interesting thing for somebody else to do. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but the purpose of the project is to look at how and what you have to face when you're designing in response to a city or parts of the city, and in collaboration with people who will be making decisions about what happens in Ahmedabad tomorrow and today.
Would another part of that be, are you engaging with the conditions of practice in such one of these firms, like 33% of major projects are in Southeast Asia, you're listing like NDVJs and big companies. The conditions in those firms might actually be, without substantial revision of the corporate structure, might be very difficult to achieve the kind of project that you're interested in.
Yeah, good. Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, I mean, one can always hope, right? I was supposed to repeat the question. The question was, well, do I expect that teaching American students some of these things is in any way going to effectively impact the corporate structure of big American firms because they are set by a particular logic? It's going to not make any difference if I sort of read what you're saying. Yeah, so it's probably not going to make any serious difference. But this is how we start framing, as I see it from an academic's point of view, how we start framing an alternative. That would be my first thing to say. And the second thing would be that this is, as I said, in the longer run, what works is the establishment of other kinds of institutions in places such as India or Thailand, etc., which again would be an academic function of we work with institutions over there to set up a particular kind of way of acting as checks and balances on the larger practices. Instead of what I have found, and this is all emerging out of what I have seen happening from the little bit, is that when we go to India or Southeast Asia, then we only go and speak to the big firms and see how we can get into that. Or we're going and seeing very traditional centers. We are not collaborating with institutions over there, which are sort of equivalent. We always still prefer to believe that in the States, we have the better expertise, so we want to just export that. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to interpret what you're saying as a leading question, which is to say that isn't working with the program and program manipulation one way in which architects might be rewriting the job that they are given. And I would say yes, definitely so. Some of the most persuasive examples of interesting work that I have found that people in basic professional practice have been doing, again, my examples are from India, has been where architects have taken up a basic program, like say this one case that I know of was to make tennis courts and a small changing room or something. How they have taken up this basic program and then working with the client and then the larger community have developed it into a much larger program, which has included spaces for the community, certain facilities for informal sector and so on, through a process of participative addition and accretion to the program. Now, how would one do this if one's program is, huge and large and very connected to a particular institutional structure and a World Bank loan is a much more difficult question. And I don't know how I would address that. But I do, on a somewhat related but different topic, I've thought that learning to manipulate program and learning to sell ourselves as people who think through new program categories that are useful for people may be one way to regain a role as social participants.